50 engineers stood frozen around the dead armored vehicle while the clock counted down 40 minutes before the general arrived. They laughed when Mason Reed, a quiet single father in a faded jacket, walked in with nothing but an old toolbox. The moment he heard a thin metallic shriek beneath the frame, his expression changed. A hidden flaw, buried and ignored, could tear the convoy apart before reaching friendly soil. Whispers followed him through the workshop, certain this man understood nothing about armored engineering. Mason knelt beside the wheel anyway, and everything they believed was about to be proven wrong. If breathless reversals and quiet underdogs pull you in, stay close, because this story only gets more intense from here. The defense plant outside Lexham, Virginia, hummed with a tension that had nothing to do with machinery and everything to do with fear. Inside the main testing bay sat Titan IX, the company's newest armored vehicle, a machine built to be faster, tougher, and safer than anything that had come before it. Every executive in the building had staked their future on this single afternoon, because a contract worth $900 million hinged on whether General Joseph Grant approved what he saw in less than an hour. 50 senior engineers had spent 3 straight days trying to get the drivetrain to respond, and none of them could explain why it refused to cooperate. Evelyn Carter, the plant's operations director, stood at the edge of the bay with her arms crossed, absorbing pressure from a board that cared only about results, not reasons. Connor Blake, the lead engineer, paced near the vehicle's flank, projecting a confidence he no longer felt. He had built his reputation on certainty, and certainty was the one thing that had abandoned him in the last 72 hours. Jason Miller, the board's representative, kept glancing at his watch and reminding Connor that someone would need an answer if the demonstration failed, and that answer could not be the company itself. Around them, junior engineers murmured theories about faulty wiring, corrupted firmware, anything that sounded technical enough to satisfy the men above them. None of it explained the strange hesitation in the vehicle's response, the way it seemed to fight its own systems instead of obeying them. It was into this chaos that Mason Reed walked, unnoticed at first, wearing a faded maintenance jacket and carrying a battered metal toolbox that had clearly seen better decades. He had not been summoned to look at the armored vehicle at all. His assignment sheet listed a secondary hydraulic lift near the back wall, nothing more. A few engineers glanced his way with the particular disdain reserved for men who fix things instead of designing them, and went back to their arguments. Mason said nothing, set down his toolbox, and let his eyes drift toward Titan IX the way a man studies a stranger's face for something familiar. Then he heard it, a thin metallic protest rising from beneath the chassis, faint enough that the engineers arguing over diagnostics had missed it entirely. The sound stopped him mid-step. It was not the clean electronic chirp of a sensor fault or the dull whine of an overworked motor. It carried the specific grinding character of metal fighting metal under uneven load, a sound he had heard before in places far rougher than this clean, fluorescent-lit bay. Connor noticed him standing there, head tilted, a smirk that maintenance staff were not paid to admire the equipment. Mason answered quietly that the sound beneath the vehicle was wrong, that whatever they were chasing in the software was not the real problem. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest cluster of engineers, because 50 credentialed professionals had failed to find the fault, and now a man with grease on his sleeves claimed to hear it from across the room. The laughter had not even finished settling when a warning light on Titan IX's dashboard snapped to a furious red, signaling that the drivetrain's core stabilizer had crossed into dangerous overheating. The room went still for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that follows a joke nobody finds funny anymore. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the only steady sound left once the laughter died away, and for a moment nobody moved at all. Engineers who had spent 3 days convinced the fault lived somewhere inside a circuit board now stared at the red warning light as if it had personally betrayed them. Somewhere behind the group, a printer kept churning out diagnostic sheets nobody had asked for anymore, the paper curling out in a slow, useless ribbon. Mason did not move toward the panic. He simply crouched lower, listening again to the sound beneath the chassis, the way a man listens for a heartbeat he already fears is irregular. He had learned long ago that machines rarely lied outright. They simply spoke in a language most people had stopped bothering to understand. Connor seized the moment to turn Mason into the morning's entertainment, sensing an easy way to redirect the room's panic into mockery instead of blame. He asked, loudly enough for everyone to hear, which university Mason had attended, whether he held a doctorate in mechanical engineering, or whether he had ever served on a military design team. Mason answered simply that he had repaired many kinds of vehicles under harsh conditions, offering nothing more about his past, no credentials to wave, no titles to lean on. His restraint only fed Connor's contempt, and Jason Miller, eager to clear the floor of distractions, ordered security to escort the maintenance worker out of the testing area so the real engineers could continue uninterrupted. Evelyn Carter, watching from the side, found herself agreeing with Connor at first. The project was too sensitive, too expensive, to entrust to a man with a toolbox and no file in the personnel system worth mentioning. Then Mason said something that froze the entire bay into silence. If they forced another startup sequence, the torque balancer would likely shatter the instant the vehicle carried real weight. Connor snapped back that Titan IX had no mechanical fault at all, insisting the failure lived somewhere in the control software, a problem his team would isolate within the hour. Mason pointed without raising his voice to a thin film of fluid beneath the rear left wheel, explaining that it was not leaking from a line but being forced backward through a seal because the driveshaft had shifted out of alignment. Amelia Brooks, the youngest engineer on the floor, leaned forward at that, because she had flagged unusual vibration readings days earlier, readings Connor had dismissed without explanation. Connor cut her off before she could finish a sentence, declaring that the maintenance man was simply guessing and wasting precious minutes they did not have. Jason offered Mason a brutal ultimatum. If his claim proved wrong, he would be terminated on the spot for interfering with restricted defense equipment. Mason started to step back, unwilling to fight for a place he had never asked for, when his phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He glanced down to see a call from his daughter's caretaker, silenced it without answering, and slid the phone away, the small motion of a father carrying more than one job at once. Evelyn caught that flicker of restraint and noticed something that did not match the picture Connor was painting. A man chasing attention would have made a scene, not tried to disappear. Before anyone could resolve the standoff, a sharp pop erupted from the secondary engine housing, sending engineers stumbling backward in alarm. Mason moved without hesitation, pulling a startled technician clear of the blast radius before a chunk of glowing metal struck the concrete where the man had been standing seconds earlier. Even after saving someone from injury, Connor rounded on him immediately, shouting that he had no authority to touch the vehicle at all. As the dust settled, a runner burst through the bay doors with news that General Joseph Grant's convoy had already left the airport, putting his arrival now barely 35 minutes away. Evelyn pulled Connor, Jason, and the department heads into an emergency meeting inside the glass office overlooking the bay, the floor below them suddenly visible through tempered panels like a stage no one wanted to perform on. Connor proposed hiding the fault entirely, running Titan IX in a restricted mode that would only allow a slow, controlled crawl in front of the general, nothing fast enough to expose the failing drivetrain. Jason agreed instantly, his only priority securing the signature on the contract first and worrying about repairs afterward, when fewer eyes were watching. Evelyn hesitated, fully aware that this machine was meant to carry soldiers into combat, and that hiding a flaw now could cost lives later in places far from this clean Virginia facility. Connor pressed harder, warning that if she refused, the board would remember her as the director who let $900 million slip away over caution. Down on the floor, Mason knelt beside the wheel well with a white cloth, studying the fluid stain and the faint vibration marks etched into the steel decking beneath the chassis. Amelia approached cautiously and asked how he had known to suspect the torque balancer before anyone else had even considered it. Mason said only that he had seen a similar failure on an older prototype years before, offering no further detail, his voice carrying the weight of something he chose not to unpack. Amelia realized in that moment that whatever Mason was, he was not simply a man who changed oil filters for a living. She told him something that changed the shape of the morning entirely. The vibration sensor data from earlier that day had been deleted from the testing system before anyone could review it. Mason understood immediately that this was no longer a simple technical oversight. Something had been deliberately concealed. Logan Pierce, the plant's internal security manager, stood at a distance and caught fragments of their conversation, quietly filing away what he heard. Connor returned to the floor and announced that the entire testing area would be sealed, restricted only to his core engineering team, with no further interference from outsiders. Mason was handed a document to sign stating that he had disrupted the inspection process, a claim he refused to put his name to because it was simply untrue. Jason threatened that a hired hand had no business standing against a major defense contractor, his tone sharpening with every word. Mason remained calm, repeating only that the vehicle would not survive a real load test in its current state. Furious, Connor ordered the system restarted in front of everyone, determined to prove the maintenance worker wrong once and for all. Titan IX roared to life, its wheels shuddering violently before the entire frame tilted at an unnatural angle. A panicked technician called out that the transmission housing temperature had blown past every safe threshold on the gauge. Mason shouted for an immediate shutdown, but Connor held the sequence running a few seconds longer, desperate for usable demonstration data. Mason lunged for the emergency cutoff switch on the auxiliary panel himself, killing the system with a violent shudder that silenced the entire bay. Connor grabbed him by the collar, accusing him of sabotaging the inspection, while Evelyn stared at the glowing red temperature readout and felt the first real doubt about everything Connor had told her settle into her chest. The smell of hot metal lingered long after the engine cut out, sharp and acrid, clinging to the back of everyone's throat. A few engineers backed away from the vehicle entirely, as though it might still detonate on its own. Jason kept repeating that they still had time, that nothing had truly gone wrong, the words sounding less convincing with every repetition. Evelyn finally pulled Connor's hand off Mason's collar herself, her voice low but absolute, telling him that whatever had just happened was no longer something a press release could fix. Mason simply exhaled, rubbed a streak of grease from his palm, and waited for someone in that glass office above them to finally ask the right question. Evelyn ordered everyone clear of the danger zone and gave Mason exactly 5 minutes to explain himself before deciding what came next. Mason did not apologize and did not plead. He simply asked to see the original blueprint of Titan IX's drivetrain, the very first version drafted before any later modifications. Connor objected fiercely, insisting that a maintenance worker had no clearance to view restricted engineering documents under any circumstance. Amelia surprised everyone by speaking up, saying that with no other working theory on the table, they owed it to the project to at least listen. Jason reluctantly allowed it, though he ordered Logan to monitor the room closely while the file was pulled up. When the blueprint appeared on the main screen, Mason immediately pointed to a single altered component, a flexible coupling joint that had been replaced with a rigid locking joint to reduce overall weight. Connor claimed the change had been an improvement made by his own team, proof of forward thinking rather than carelessness. Mason explained that on paper the rigid joint allowed faster response times, but under uneven terrain loads, the twisting force would funnel backward directly into the transmission housing instead of dispersing safely. He added that the flaw never surfaced in simulation because the simulation modeled flat, even roads, while a real armored vehicle would cross broken ground, gravel and uneven ridges in actual deployment. Evelyn asked how he could possibly know this with such confidence. Mason paused before answering, then admitted that years earlier he had taken part in a field testing unit for a prototype with a nearly identical structure. Connor scoffed, arguing that field testing carried none of the rigor of formal engineering design. Mason pointed to a small auxiliary line in the control code, explaining that this segment had been quietly compensating for the mechanical flaw all along, meaning the software was not the cause of the failure but its unwitting victim. Amelia checked the logic herself and confirmed Mason was right. The program kept reducing output force because its sensors were registering abnormal vibration patterns it could not otherwise explain. Jason grew visibly nervous, realizing that if Mason was correct, every technical report Connor had filed amounted to a deliberate fabrication. Connor shifted tactics, arguing that even if Mason had found the fault, nobody could repair it before General Joseph Grant arrived. Mason asked for the old parts storage to be unlocked so he could retrieve a flexible coupling joint from a prototype that had been scrapped years earlier. Evelyn warned that the storage room had been sealed since that earlier project collapsed. Mason replied that the project had not failed because of bad design, but because someone had cut its funding before testing could ever finish. The remark landed like a blow, and Connor's face drained of color, suggesting he knew far more about that history than he wanted to admit. Logan quietly pulled the old storage records and discovered that Connor himself had signed the order to destroy the prototype's testing data that same year. Evelyn overrode every objection and ordered the parts room unlocked at once. 28 minutes remained before General Joseph Grant's arrival, and the clock seemed to tick louder with every passing second. Mason, Amelia, and a small group of technicians rushed down to the old parts storage beneath the main factory floor. Dust coated everything inside, shelves stacked with components discarded from older military programs that had never reached production. Mason found the flexible coupling joint he needed, but it was corroded, missing a gasket, and stripped of any modern certification code. Amelia worried that using outdated, uncertified parts could disqualify them from the inspection entirely. Mason explained that he had no intention of installing the original part as it was. Instead, he planned to use its inner core as a temporary torsion buffer to save the drivetrain just long enough to survive the test. While they worked, Connor quietly called a contact on the board, claiming that Mason was actively wrecking the demonstration beyond repair. Jason demanded that Evelyn stop Mason immediately, warning that any unauthorized repair causing an accident would create enormous legal exposure for the company. Evelyn faced an impossible choice between rigid procedure and trusting a man the entire system had dismissed without a second thought. She decided to sign an emergency repair authorization on the condition that Mason accept full technical responsibility under his own signature. Mason signed without hesitation, a small gesture that revealed he was not merely talking, but willing to carry the consequences himself. Connor sneered that Mason had just signed his own termination notice. Mason said nothing and slid beneath Titan IX's chassis to begin the repair. The scene grew tense quickly. Hot fluid dripped down, bolts stuck fast. The gap for the new component was barely wide enough, and the cooling system kept climbing back toward dangerous temperatures. Amelia passed him tools exactly as instructed, slowly understanding that Mason possessed something close to a photographic memory for mechanical systems. One engineer who had laughed at Mason earlier fell silent, quietly assisting once he saw how precisely Mason isolated the faulty cluster within minutes. The man's name was Reed Pierce, no relation to Logan, and he had spent the morning calling Mason's diagnosis a guess loud enough for everyone to hear. Now he held the work light steady without being asked, watching Mason's hands move with a fluency that no classroom could have taught. Nobody apologized out loud, but the silence itself carried something close to an apology, the kind that came from simply choosing to help instead of mock. Mason discovered a locking ring installed backward in error. 50 engineers had missed entirely because they had been staring at software readouts instead of the hardware itself. He said aloud that a ring like that could not install itself backward. Either someone had been careless, or someone had wanted it that way. Logan, overhearing this, immediately pulled the security footage from the original assembly area. With 17 minutes left, Mason needed a heat-resistant gasket the storage room no longer had in stock. He looked around, pulled a scrap of alloy from an old discarded shield panel, and machined a replacement gasket himself on the workshop's small bench lathe. The room held its breath, watching him work with a precision that bordered on impossible for someone holding nothing but hand tools and scavenged metal. The gate alarm sounded a moment later, signaling that General Joseph Grant's convoy had already entered the factory grounds, far earlier than anyone had prepared for. General Joseph Grant arrived earlier than scheduled, flanked by a small escort of officers and defense inspectors moving with quiet, practiced efficiency. Jason rushed out to greet him, forcing calm into his voice as he claimed the demonstration was merely undergoing final preparation. General Grant had spent decades in combat zones, and he recognized the strained atmosphere immediately for what it was. He asked why the testing bay smelled faintly of burnt oil, and why the lead engineer was nowhere near the vehicle he was supposed to present. Connor stepped forward, eager to control the narrative, claiming a maintenance employee had interfered without authorization and delayed the entire process. At that moment, Mason remained beneath the chassis, hands stained with fluid, tightening the final joint on his improvised repair. General Grant heard the name Mason Reed mentioned and paused slightly, though he said nothing yet. Connor recommended canceling the inspection entirely, blaming the delay squarely on maintenance interference. Jason agreed quickly, eager to turn Mason into a convenient scapegoat for the entire morning's chaos. Evelyn interrupted sharply, stating plainly that the fault had existed long before Mason ever touched the vehicle. The room tensed further since this marked the first time Evelyn had openly broken from Connor and Jason in front of an outside authority. General Grant asked directly who exactly was working underneath the vehicle right now. Mason slid out from beneath Titan IX and stood, his uniform smeared with grease, facing a row of uniformed officers without flinching. A few engineers still regarded him as someone who did not belong in that conversation at all. General Grant asked Mason what precisely he was doing. Mason answered with calm precision, explaining that he was redistributing reverse torque through a temporary flexible coupling, because without it the transmission housing would fracture the moment the vehicle attempted a simulated incline. The inspectors exchanged glances, surprised by the technical clarity of a man they had assumed was simply hired labor. Connor tried to interject, insisting that this analysis remained unverified and speculative. Amelia stepped forward and presented the restored vibration data, confirming that Mason's diagnosis had been accurate from the very beginning. Logan added that the morning's sensor data had been manually deleted from the lead engineer's own account. Connor's composure cracked slightly, though he continued to deny any wrongdoing. General Grant ordered that no one leave the testing bay until the inspection was fully resolved. Mason said he needed exactly 6 more minutes to finish the repair properly, rather than rush a half-finished fix in front of an audience. General Grant studied him for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes like recognition pulled from an old, half-forgotten file, and granted him precisely 6 minutes. Mason finished his repair exactly as the countdown reached 0, wiping his hands once on a rag before stepping back from the vehicle. Connor still hoped, quietly, that Titan IX would fail and vindicate everything he had claimed, even as he feared what success would reveal about his own deception. General Grant ordered the full inspection sequence, with no shortcuts: cold start, heavy load acceleration, simulated incline climbing, emergency braking, and a sharp evasive turn. Jason panicked internally, certain that a full sequence was far too risky for a repair completed under such desperate conditions. Mason said plainly that if the vehicle could not survive a genuine test, it had no business going anywhere near a battlefield. That single sentence seemed to settle something in General Grant's expression, the words of a man who understood that soldiers' lives mattered more than any signature on a contract. Titan IX roared back to life, its engine note deeper and steadier than before, free of the metallic shriek that had haunted it all morning. Amelia watched the vibration readouts fall safely within range, and several engineers who had mocked Mason earlier now exchanged uneasy, silent glances. The vehicle rolled onto the internal test track, its heavy steel wheels grinding across the simulated incline. Connor quietly hoped some hidden reading would spike past its limit, giving him one last chance to be right. As Titan IX climbed the angled slope, a warning indicator flashed amber without warning. Jason immediately called for the test to stop. His voice cracked on the word stop, the sound of a man watching $900 million teeter on a single-gauge reading. Mason did not flinch. He had spent enough years around machines under real strain to know the difference between a system failing and a system simply complaining about conditions it had never been calibrated for. Mason studied the readout and told them to continue, explaining that the alert came from an older sensor that had not yet been recalibrated, not from any failure in the drivetrain itself. General Grant asked if he was certain. Mason answered that if he were wrong, the breaking point would appear within 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds stretched unbearably, every person in the room holding their breath in unison. Titan IX did not brake. Instead, it powered up the incline with surprising strength. The vehicle moved through emergency braking, a sharp evasive turn, and a stretch of artificial rocky terrain, every reading holding steady the entire time. The silence in the bay shifted into something different now, no longer mockery, but something closer to disbelief. Connor's face drained of color as Titan IX performed better than it ever had in any previous trial. Mason did not celebrate. He simply listened to the engine, eyes locked on the chassis, attentive to details no one else seemed to notice. During the final test, the right side brake lock responded with a slight delay. Mason called for an immediate stop just past the safety line, pointing out a second flaw buried inside the brake distribution algorithm. Connor argued the flaw was minor enough to omit from the official report. Mason countered that on a real battlefield, even a small braking delay could roll an entire vehicle and its crew. General Grant ordered every technical file opened immediately, and Mason located the second flaw inside an unapproved software update that no one had cleared through proper reporting routes. Logan recovered files from the internal server and discovered numerous warning reports that had been quietly marked as unimportant over the past several weeks. Every single one of those reports had been filed by Amelia, only to be intercepted by Connor before they ever reached Evelyn's desk. Evelyn felt a sharp sting of betrayal, realizing she had trusted Connor's clean reports while genuine warnings sat buried beneath them the entire time. Connor tried blaming the data management system itself, insisting there was no proof he had hidden anything intentionally. Logan presented camera footage showing Connor entering the assembly area alone the night before, inspecting the drivetrain components without any witnesses present. Connor claimed he had simply been performing a final check before the inspection. Mason reviewed the footage and recognized the exact moment Connor removed a protective cover from the precise spot where the locking ring had been installed backward. Jason began distancing himself from Connor immediately, insisting the board had known nothing about any of this. General Grant requested Mason's full technical background be pulled for review. Jason mocked the idea, certain Mason's file would contain nothing beyond basic maintenance records. Logan typed Mason Reed into the older archive system and found a portion of his file sealed under a previous military order. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. General Grant requested special clearance to view the sealed material. When the file opened, everyone learned that Mason had once served as a field technician in a classified armored vehicle testing program, working far from any office or design studio. He had not been an engineer on paper, but the man who saved multiple test crews through emergency mechanical solutions under brutal field conditions. One line in his file noted that Mason had proposed a torsion-resistant flexible joint years earlier, an idea rejected only because funding for the program had been cut. Amelia realized that the very component Mason had just installed was an improved version of that same rejected design. General Grant confirmed he remembered reading a report about a young field technician who had saved a prototype during one especially brutal testing exercise. Connor fell silent, knowing he had borrowed part of Mason's original idea without ever crediting the source in his current design. Mason had no interest in turning this into personal revenge. He said only that what mattered now was making sure the vehicle was actually safe. That calm restraint deepened Evelyn's respect for him even further. General Grant turned to Connor and asked a question that hung heavy in the air. Why had a rejected idea from years earlier resurfaced inside the current project, while Mason Reed's name had vanished from every relevant document along the way? Connor tried to argue that every design belonged to the company itself, and that no credit was owed to a field technician for an idea absorbed into the broader engineering process. General Grant replied that ownership of ideas was not the real issue. The real issue was that Connor had altered the design, suppressed warnings, and nearly delivered a flawed vehicle into a military contract. Evelyn demanded that the entire email chain related to Titan IX be opened for everyone present to review. Logan found a message Connor had sent to Jason, openly admitting the drivetrain carried risk while recommending they delay any repairs until after the contract was signed. Jason's face went pale, since the message proved he had known at least part of the truth far earlier than he admitted. Jason tried shifting all responsibility onto Connor, claiming he had never understood the technical language in the reports. Amelia pushed back immediately, stating she had sent a plain language summary warning about rollover risk under uneven loads weeks earlier. Evelyn realized that greed for the contract had quietly pushed leadership to look past basic safety concerns. Connor turned on Mason angrily, claiming that if he had never shown up, the entire situation would have been resolved quietly and without incident. Mason answered that if it had been resolved Connor's way, soldiers on a real battlefield would have paid the price instead. That single sentence pushed General Grant to make his decision right there on the spot. He suspended the contract signing immediately and ordered a full independent investigation into the entire project. Jason spiraled into panic, watching $900 million threaten to vanish in front of him. Evelyn accepted responsibility as operations director, while promising full cooperation with the investigation and a complete redesign built around genuine safety standards. General Grant respected that she had chosen accountability instead of continuing to hide behind excuses. Logan ordered Connor to surrender his access badge and escorted him out of the engineering wing under close supervision. Before leaving, Connor sneered at Mason, insisting a man like him would always be a mechanic and never belong inside a real design department. General Grant cut him off sharply, stating that on a real battlefield, the person who kept a vehicle running was exactly the person soldiers trusted with their lives. The bay fell completely silent. Mason showed no sign of triumph, simply lowering his head and wiping the fluid from his hands. Evelyn asked whether Mason would be willing to lead the team in fully repairing Titan IX going forward. Mason agreed, but only under one condition. Every flaw had to be documented honestly, with no one allowed to polish a report just to protect a contract. General Grant accepted the condition without hesitation, and Mason was placed in charge of the emergency repair team, standing in front of the very 50 engineers who had laughed at him only hours earlier. None of them laughed now. A few studied the floor, unable to meet his eyes after everything that had happened. Amelia stood a little straighter beside him, no longer the quiet voice nobody listened to, but someone whose warnings had just changed the course of an entire program. Evelyn watched the two of them and felt something close to relief settle over the chaos of the morning, the first calm breath she had taken since the sun came up. Mason did not accept his new role with arrogance. He began instead by handing out clear, specific assignments to every engineering group on the floor. He asked Amelia to lead the full restoration of sensor data, assigned one team to disassemble the drivetrain cluster, and sent another to rebuild realistic terrain simulations matching actual deployment conditions. The engineers who had mocked him earlier that morning shifted uncomfortably, but Mason never brought up the past insults. He asked only that they do their work correctly and report any flaws honestly without exception. This small shift quietly transformed the culture of the entire workshop, moving it away from fear of blame and toward an open effort to catch problems before they caused real harm. Evelyn observed Mason as he worked and recognized that his leadership came not from any title, but from the steady calm he carried under enormous pressure. Mason identified 3 essential corrections the design needed: a torsion-resistant flexible joint, a braking algorithm responsive to uneven loads, and a vibration sensor relocated nearer the rear axle. Amelia suggested a software solution to assist the transition, but Mason reminded her that software should never disguise a mechanical flaw, only support a design that was already sound. General Grant granted them exactly 4 hours to produce a working technical correction that could prove this new direction was capable of saving the entire project. Jason tried calling the board to protect his position, only to find that Logan had already revoked his access to the project's internal data. Evelyn formally reported to the board that every decision moving forward would prioritize safety over public image. In one quiet moment, Mason received a brief phone call from his daughter's caretaker. He simply asked whether she had eaten dinner yet and said he would be home later than planned. Nothing more. No description of the child herself, no detour into a separate storyline. That short call revealed a man who was not some distant hero, but someone quietly carrying ordinary responsibilities alongside an extraordinary day. Evelyn overheard the exchange but said nothing, understanding now exactly why Mason had been so reluctant to lose his job despite everything he had endured that morning. Mason returned to work, guiding his team with unbroken focus through the remaining hours. After 4 hours, Titan IX was reconfigured for a second formal test. General Grant requested conditions even harsher than the original inspection had demanded. This time, Titan IX crossed rocky terrain, climbed steep inclines, braked sharply, and handled aggressive turning loads without crossing a single dangerous threshold. The engineers let out a quiet wave of relief. Those ones still insisted every remaining limitation be documented for the official record. General Grant remarked that this was the first time all day he had heard someone report both strengths and weaknesses without trying to hide either one. He announced that the contract remained unsigned for now, but that the Titan IX program would move forward for further review, provided Mason Reed remained part of the official redesign team going forward. After the second test, the board convened an emergency session to address everything that had unfolded that day. Connor was suspended and placed under formal investigation for manipulating data, concealing technical flaws, and threatening employees who tried to speak honestly. Jason was removed from his oversight role for placing the value of a single contract above the safety of the people who would eventually rely on the vehicle. Evelyn voluntarily accepted blame for allowing a culture of pressure to silence honest reporting from her own staff. Mason was invited into the boardroom, a space he had never been permitted to enter before that day. Some board members remained skeptical at first, uneasy that a man without an impressive academic record now held such influence over a major defense program. General Grant placed Mason's sealed file on the table and remarked that field experience could often matter more than a polished slide presentation ever could. Evelyn proposed appointing Mason as lead technical advisor for the entire Titan IX program. Mason did not accept immediately. Instead, he asked whether Amelia and the other engineers who had been ignored for weeks would finally be given a direct reporting line to report danger without interference. Evelyn agreed to establish an independent safety reporting system, one no single person could quietly shut down again. Mason also asked that any design drawing on field testing contributions properly credit the people who had actually contributed to it. This was not simply a demand for personal recognition, but a stand for every overlooked technician, mechanic, and soldier whose work had been treated as invisible for years. General Grant fully supported the request. The board had little choice but to agree, knowing that refusal risked losing the military's confidence entirely. Mason accepted his new position, though his manner remained as humble as it had been that morning. He had no interest in revenge against the people who had mocked him. He simply wanted to change how the factory built equipment for people heading into danger. Amelia was promoted to lead the testing data division, proof that honesty carried real weight inside the company now. Evelyn personally apologized to Mason for nearly allowing the entire system to crush him without a second thought. Mason told her that no apology was necessary, so long as she protected the truth going forward, even when convenient lies would have been easier to tell. As he stepped out of the boardroom, he walked past the very engineers who had once laughed at him, and every one of them stepped quietly aside to let him through. Several weeks later, Titan IX returned for an official trial at the military's primary testing ground. The new design was no longer a polished product rushed toward a quick signature. It had been rebuilt using honest data, acknowledged flaws, and genuine accountability throughout every stage of the process. Mason stood beside Evelyn, Amelia, and General Joseph Grant as the vehicle entered its final round of evaluation. There was no laughter this time, and no trace of the contempt that had once followed him through the workshop. The engineers who had failed weeks earlier now regarded Mason as something closer to a mentor, a man who had reminded them that machines never lie, only the people responsible for them sometimes choose to. Titan IX passed every test cleanly, handling heavy loads, uneven terrain, and emergency braking with results that held steady from start to finish. General Grant did not sign the contract out of relief or emotion. He signed it only after reading through a fully transparent technical report from beginning to end. He told the assembled team that the military did not need a vehicle that looked flawless on paper, but a team honest enough to fix real problems before those problems cost lives. Evelyn announced a new safety initiative for the entire facility, with Mason placed at the head of field evaluation going forward. Mason kept his remarks brief, saying only that every bolt, every sensor, and every line of code could be connected to someone's life on the other end of it. That simple sentence settled over the room, a quiet reminder that Mason had never been chasing personal validation. He had been trying to prevent a disaster from reaching people who would never even know his name. As evening settled over the testing ground, Mason walked away from the vehicle while the sky shifted into deep amber light. His phone buzzed once with a short message confirming that his daughter had already fallen asleep for the night. He allowed himself a small, quiet smile, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and watched Titan IX complete one final pass along the test road. Evelyn watched him from a distance, fully understanding now that the man once dismissed as nothing more than a low-level repair worker had saved an entire program, an entire company, and quite possibly many lives waiting somewhere down the line. General Grant turned to Logan and remarked that sometimes the most important person in any room is the one nobody else bothers to look at twice. The story closed on Mason stepping away from the factory gates, his old toolbox still in hand, while behind him, for the first time in a very long while, not a single person was laughing. What remained clear above everything else was simple. True worth was never measured by a title on a door, but by competence, integrity, and the courage to speak the truth when everyone around you would rather look away. The gates closed behind him with a slow metallic groan, ordinary and unremarkable, the same sound they made every evening for every worker who walked through them. Yet something in the air felt different now, lighter somehow, as though the entire factory had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long.